Now just accept that and somehow we just evolve in a particular way that, maybe that, or not, I don't know the answer to that. It's really almost bothersome to me.
But Facebook will be like MySpace in a few years. We'll have a great amount of churn. We'll be moving toward the next form of social media, whatever that is. Again, Twitter is just an artifact of the last, 8 to 10 years, and we'll have in the future other forms of media that provide new problems. Political Snapchat, for example, that disappears as soon as one sees it. Lots of other issues.
Thank you to the panelists.
Yes, indeed. I thought that was quite a provocative set of comments. I can't help but to think that on the one hand, progress has been astoundingly fast. And on the other hand, I remember 25 years ago thinking, within the next 10 years, I'll have a Mac or a PC that when I do repetitive tasks, it will say, hey, I see you keep doing this thing over and over again. Would you like me to automate that for you and just take it on from there? So I thought that would be happening in 10 years. Well, that was 15 years ago, and it still isn't happening now. So what I would say is there's a tremendous discontinuity in technology and its abilities. So the other thing I keep expecting is to have artificial people who can represent me online, expressing my views in a more articulate way than I could on the issues that I care about, since it just would sort of do a personality x-ray and say, oh, you're this kind of person, so you get involved with rainforest preservation, but single stream recycling and all these other activities. Once again, I'm waiting for those evolutions, and I know Azur's immediately thinking of all the things that contradict what I just said. And I look forward in the next 15 minutes during the break to engage him on that, and I invite you all to also engage with each other, and I think the posters as well. So thank you once again to our panelists.
I can tell you about 6
that's
we're gonna
where
have.
historians said we know that.
Yeah. Exactly.
And nothing.
Yeah.
And there was a wonderful thing that Louis Nanner said. There was a historian at length understands what cannot happen in history. And one thing that cannot happen in history is indefinite progress.
Right. It doesn't just keep going up.
Yeah.
What goes up must come down, so to speak.
Cannot.
Okay, Jim seems to be over at the bar. Or maybe but I'll just yes, drinking.
We are ready, and
We are
we're the
ready.
only one without slides. So glad.
A man of grand experience.
That's good.
You need no slides after those other things.
You know that.
He gave a wonderful talk. Oh, it's just amazing.
I know.
There was so much in there, Balzac too.
Yeah, I was feeling very jealous about these pictures on the other slides too. Mine is way more minimalist, so you know.
Well, we don't have
Like,
these nice, like Jacob can make these beautiful maps, black box maps, but they're not that hard to make. He
Yeah.
taught me the software. So you see them at first and you think, are in government.
Yeah,
But
so,
they are beautiful.
They are. Yeah, they are.
Dominic slides this morning. I want a copy of the slides just to do that. I hope we can get each other's slides. I'll ask Jim if people are willing
To share them.
to share them. Pressure and memories.
Yeah,
Otherwise
yeah.
you have to take notes.
Yeah.
And I do that, but then
Yeah, but it's hard to kind of. If you actually have the slides, it's so much easier to kind of reimagine what happened.
you were kind and I'm doing journalism. And I'm thinking, many people will share slides.
Oh, I share my own slides.
Yeah.
The other ones. Yeah. Here I don't have slides, but I have a paper. Exactly that.
I know these things, but I don't know when I'll have time to sit down. I hope I did not. Usually Jim does a good job of dropping off.
Yeah.
You think you can find it. Okay, here it is. Yes, AJ. Okay, right. So I guess. Is that my job?
I'll see.
Yeah, they have their fancy.
Yeah, it's great.
They have their fancy.
And everybody's slides who have slides is okay. And we have a Mac.
College of Arts and Science.
Oh, so you're gonna do that, and then Jacob's gonna switch, and that's okay.
Kind of same research oriented.
I guess we just plug that in. Okay, so.
Yeah, I think it's going to be super easy, basically.
Yeah, so we have some folks who do like journalism, mass comm, related research, but definitely more like political comm or comm, interpersonal comm. Yeah. So, but yeah, we do serve a lot of committees together, and then a lot of Gaylor students come to take our courses. Yeah. Whereas our students really don't go there very much. But,
Well, I enjoyed your talk a lot.
Thank you.
You're doing a lot of interesting work. I don't know how you keep it all straight, with the
All that
different
graph.
effects and
Yeah, it's sort of not obviously directly on the news, but I just happen to have this paper that kind of have implications on it. And my advisor is organizing a good conference and great chance to visit Boston. So I just applied. He's like, yeah, you should come over. I'm like, I'm really enjoying listening to other people's talk as well because it happens to be the same week. Like when I'm going back this Wednesday, the Thursday, the next day, the whole campus, the OU campus, the graduate students organizing a fake news panel, and I'm providing the panel. So, hey, I have nothing to say, but I'm learning a lot from this conference. So hopefully, I'll have something to contribute there.
my participation is also kind of a little bit sideways because I think somebody canceled such a massive exhibit from the disadvantage and put a spot, and I didn't getting any.
It seemed like he was already still in programming. Doing his master's.
Oh, maybe Jason Chu. See,
which would be easier and faster, period.
the reason I know most of this is I don't get anyone.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll now call the final session of the day to order. And I'll ask everyone to take his and her respective seats. Well, some of you may have seen the Boston University publication, online publication today called BU Today. And in that, Juliet and I we have a photo there reflecting what we hope metaphorically will be understood to be the shadows in Plato's cave. And you may know that metaphor from Plato's Republic, where people are not able to see the truth. They only see shadows by players cast upon a wall, and people interpret that as the truth. And in the preparation of that article, Juliet and I, during the interview, said something about the truth. And then the reporter said, "What is truth?" And so there was a philosophical answer and a pragmatic answer, respectively, from Juliet the philosopher and me the pragmatist. But today we'll have a chance to go into greater length into that question vis-a-vis the topic of journalism and the search for truth in an age of social media. So I will now invite my dear colleague, Juliet Floyd, to begin chairing the final panel of the afternoon. Juliet.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I agreed with everything you said about truth as a pragmatist. William James had that metaphor of credit that Ozer was building on before. So it's an evergreen topic for us, bread and butter, but we would like to move philosophy into the world of social media. So first we'll hear from Alex Crouch, who is a postdoc at MIT in the philosophy department. And Alex, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for the organizers for inviting me. You know, it's really great to be at a conference full of empiricists. You know, as a philosopher, it makes me particularly sensitive, so I have to make sure that all of my claims are particularly fact insensitive. But anyways, we're looking forward to a kind of good discussion and trying to kind of integrate some philosophical concerns with people who actually know how the world actually works. So what I'm going to talk about today is what's called hermeneutic justice. You're probably not familiar with that term. That's a term that was coined by a woman named Miranda Fricker. And what it means is a species of justice or injustice that concerns individuals' abilities to understand and interpret their experiences. You might not understand that yet. Don't worry. I'm going to talk more about it, what it means during the talk. And particularly what I'm going to try to do in this talk is three things. I'm going to first explain what hermeneutic justice is, or what it's kind of taken to be in its kind of paradigmatic instantiation. Then I'm going to give some alternative account of hermeneutic justice that ties hermeneutic justice to some things that we are talking about in the conference, stuff about the media and media structure in particular. And then I'm going to say a bit about why one should care about these two different ways of understanding hermeneutic justice. Basically, the answer to that question is going to be that I think if you understand hermeneutic justice in the way that I'm going to go on to explain at the talk, then you have a normative framework for thinking about certain kinds of complaints that you often hear about the media in everyday political discourse. Kind of complaints like, well, my voice isn't being heard, or like the media is being unfair to me, and stuff like this. So basically what I'm trying to do in the talk is kind of think through some normative questions and provide a kind of framework for understanding what those kinds of complaints are about. Okay, but I'm going to do that in this slightly indirect way by kind of going through this kind of other theory of hermeneutic justice. Okay, so I'm just going to start off by telling you what hermeneutic injustice is. or was what's taken to be. So this term comes from a book written by a woman named Miranda Fricker. The book is called Epistemic Injustice. Epistemic injustice is a term for the kind of injustice one suffers as a knower. And one species of epistemic injustice is the kind of injustice that we'll be talking about in this talk. That's what she calls hermeneutic injustice. That is the kind of injustice that you suffer as an interpreter of your own social experience or your point of view. Now, the easiest way to kind of understand what that means is to think about the sort of paradigm case that Fricker has in mind, which is kind of developing her theory. So that's what I'm going to mention first. So here's the kind of thing that Fricker is thinking about when she thinks about hermeneutic injustice. Take the situation of women kind of pre-consciousness raising and the sexual harassment that they experienced in the workplace. What Fricker argues is that before there was the concept or the term sexual harassment, women in that situation who were experiencing sexual harassment had a difficult time kind of understanding, but particularly articulating this aspect of their experience in the workplace. And that's because the sorts of behaviors that we now call behaviors that constitute sexual harassment were typically coded differently. They might be coded as flirting, they might be coded as kind of joking around and all these kind of other ways. And so as a result of that, women who suffered from sexual harassment had a difficult time, first of all, articulating to themselves what exactly was going on, and second of all, kind of communicating what was going on to other people. Now, Fricker's idea is that in that sort of situation, women face have two distinct kinds of injustice. On the one hand, there was the kind of injustice they face simply in virtue of being sexually harassed. And now this is the thing that Fricker is interested in, there is a second distinct kind of injustice that they also faced. This injustice that they were unable to effectively understand and communicate this aspect of their social experience to others. Now, okay, so to kind of just put a little bit of structure on this kind of way of understanding what hermeneutic injustice is, you can kind of divide up the way that Fricker is thinking about this paradigm case into two different parts. On the one hand, there's a conception of a particular kind of disadvantage, which he calls hermeneutic disadvantage. So hermeneutic is just a fancy term for interpretation. Are people aware of this? So basically, what Fricker thinks is that there's a certain kind of disadvantage that these women faced, and that was that there was a certain gap in the set of concepts that they had available to them, and that gap prevented them from effectively interpreting their experiences and then communicating that interpretation to others. And then secondly, the reason why that sort of disadvantage constitutes an injustice is that, Fricker says, the reason why it was that women lacked these particular concepts, namely the concepts like sexual harassment, was due to what she calls identity prejudice, in this case, background sexism. So basically, Fricker's idea is that the reason why it wasn't just a sad fact of life that women weren't able to articulate their experiences, and rather it was an injustice, is because the reason why they were unable to effectively articulate those experiences was due to this sort of bad attitude on the parts of various actors in the social community, namely prejudice. Okay, so that's how Fricker comes to this particular definition of hermeneutic injustice. She says that hermeneutic injustice is the injustice of having a significant aspect of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutic resources, right? So that might be a little bit of a complicated definition, but hopefully people can understand it now. Basically, the idea is that there's some aspect of your social experience, in this case, this experience of sexual harassment in the workplace, that is obscured from collective understanding. Other people can't easily understand what is going on there. They might misinterpret it, say, as flirting. And the reason why that women and also other people in the social community were liable to not understand this experience in the right way is due to structural identity prejudice, that is sexism.
Alex, can you just define hermeneutic?
Yeah, so hermeneutic is just the study of interpretation. That's hermeneutics. So what this kind of injustice concerns, why it's called hermeneutic injustice, is because it's injustice that deals with issues of interpretation. In this case, it's the interpretation of your social experience. Does that make sense? Yes, thank you. Okay, so that's why it's hermeneutic injustice. Okay, so that's Fricker. That is one conception of hermeneutic injustice. Now, in the second part of the talk, what I'm going to do is raise some questions about this account of hermeneutic injustice and propose an alternative conception of what hermeneutic injustice is. And the way I'm going to do that is by starting by thinking about a particular kind of case, and then talking about the structure of that case, and then proposing an alternative conception of hermeneutic injustice that ties it to some of the things that we've been talking about in this conference, namely stuff like the structure of the media. Okay, so let's just think about a particular concrete case. Imagine the following case. You're a professor. You're holding office hours. Those office hours are the day before there's going to be a class debate about an important political issue, say abortion. And now 2 students come to see you. You've got student A. Student A is pro-life. And you got student B. Student B is pro-choice. Now, both of those students are very passionate about this political issue, but also in both of the cases, they don't really have a very well worked out viewpoint. So neither of the students is really in the position to effectively articulate arguments about why one should be either pro-choice or pro-life. Okay, so now imagine that both those students come in, and you as the professor, you help out one of the students, but you don't help out the other. And you help out the one in a particular way. You help, say, the pro-life student better articulate the kind of proto or inchoate arguments that student has. But in the case of the second student, the pro-choice student, say, you do something that's more like logic chopping. You try to point out some kind of problems, you point out some inconsistencies in what the student is saying, but you don't do this, you don't try to help that student better articulate the inchoate arguments or viewpoint that student has. Okay, so then that's the structure of the case. You kind of imagine then that in the debate that comes in the class the next day, of course, the pro-life student does much, much better in that debate than the pro-choice student, right? Because the pro-life student is much more effective at articulating her views about the morality of abortion than the pro-choice student. So there's a kind of concrete way in which the pro-life student has kind of advantage in the context of discussion in the classroom debate. Okay, so that's just a case to think about. Why is this case interesting? Well, I think this case poses a particular problem for how one could think of hermeneutic injustice on this model that I had just mentioned earlier. Why is that? Okay, well, here's the structure of that case. First of all, the pro-choice student is in a state of relative hermeneutic disadvantage. Remember that pro-choice student isn't really able to effectively articulate the kind of inchoate view that student has. Moreover, the fact that student is in that state is unfair, you might think. However, it's not. And so therefore, the idea is that the pro-choice student is a victim of hermeneutic injustice because it's unfair that student is in this state of hermeneutic disadvantage. However, this case doesn't really fit the sort of model that I previously mentioned. Why is that? Well, first of all, there are no missing concepts. There's no kind of key concept that one of the students is missing. Rather, it's more like that the student has not been given a particular kind of hermeneutic help. Now, that help takes the form not of giving the students any kinds of concepts, but rather that help would take the form of, say, enabling them to more effectively articulate kind of argument. It might take the form of showing the students different sorts of inferential connections between the different things that the students are thinking. Basically, a whole set of different kinds of things that you might do to better enable someone to interpret some kind of either experience that they have or some sort of view type or argument type that they have, but they're not able to effectively articulate to themselves or articulate to others. Moreover, what is going on here is not necessarily that the students are unable to articulate something about their experience. It's rather that they're not able to articulate something about their point of view. So for all I said in the case, there's nothing, it might be the case that neither student has any more direct social experience with abortion. It's rather that they have different sort of political perspectives on that issue. And then third, although there's this is a case of unfairness, it's not a case in which prejudice is playing any role in the case necessarily. What explains the unfairness is simply the fact that in virtue of the fact that both students are kind of co-equals, they're kind of equal members of the class, they have equal claim to the professor's help, but they're not getting equal help. So we have a kind of a case of unfairness, but one in which there's no prejudice. Okay, so that's the kind of a simple toy case. Now, you might say, well, so this is kind of what's the diagnosis of the case that I just mentioned. So the students have a kind of claim to equal help, but they're not getting equal help. And what that does is it prevents the students from being on a par in the context of political debate in the classroom discussion. Okay, so that's a kind of really simple little case. Why should it be interesting for the things that we're talking about here? Well, because I think that kind of toy case kind of serves as a sort of model for something that actually is quite important when we're thinking about the context of public discussion. So let's kind of think about how we kind of scale that model up to think about things that have more direct political importance. So consider this. So some people have claimed that, say, if you compare two different social movements, say the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Now, social movements are the kind of things that, just by it's part of the nature of a social movement. People come together, they have some extremely inchoate viewpoint, they like yell some stuff, they've got a bunch of slogans. Generally, the kind of political perspective isn't worked out so well, but they're trying to kind of get some voice out there in the public sphere. Now, some people have claimed that you don't have to agree with this empirically. Just imagine if this is the case, if you don't agree empirically, that the media reported on, say, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street differently. So some people have kind of claimed this generally from a perspective of the left. They've said that, well, the Tea Party got all this hermeneutic help from, say, Fox News, but also from the mainstream media. There are all these people out there who are saying, okay, we've got all these people kind of chanting all these slogans, I'm going to take my country back. And there are these media organizations that were trying to make rational sense of that stuff, to kind of put on display the kind of arguments and the political ideology of that social movement. But by contrast, there was not the same kind of help given to this other social movement, say the Occupy movement, where there much of the media reporting concerned, say, the ways in which the protest was disruptive, maybe some things about the personalities of the protest, but there wasn't the same sort of hermeneutic help given to the protesters. That is, there weren't kind of media people who were trying to say, hey, here's what the broader political ideology is, and kind of put that on display and enable other citizens to understand that.
Alex, you're at 15.
I'm at 15 here? All right, great. So let me just scoot ahead here then. Okay, so this kind of brings up the basic idea I have about how to understand an alternative way of understanding hermeneutic injustice. Here you start from the conception of some kind of epistemic system. So that might be your linguistic practices, but it will also be a whole bunch of other practices and institutions, say the institutions of science, the institutions of the media, and the schools. And then questions of epistemic justice are just questions about the standards of fairness that apply to that whole set of institutions taken together. And so a theory of hermeneutic justice is a theory about the standards of fairness for the provision of this particular kind of help, this sort of hermeneutic aid within the epistemic system. So that's basically the kind of core idea. You can understand hermeneutic injustice as a theory about the standards of fairness for the kind of basic structure of your set of epistemic institutions, rather than thinking about it as a kind of concern about concepts and their causal histories. Okay, so I'm just going to scoot ahead here and say what the, here's the difference. On the one hand, we have a different conception of hermeneutic disadvantage. On the one hand, in the Fricker case, the idea is that you're disadvantaged in virtue of lacking a certain concept. In the account that I give, you're disadvantaged in virtue of there being a particular pattern of hermeneutic concern. Some people get help, other people don't get help. What makes the disadvantage unjust in the case of Fricker is the causal history. My own account, it's not really about the causal history. It's about the fact that certain sorts of patterns of concern might be, by their nature, intrinsically unfair, and they might have certain effects, that is, the effects of distorting democratic discussion. Okay, so kind of why care about this? Well, the reason to care about it, I think, is because if you have, depending on how you understand the problem of hermeneutic injustice, then you'll have a different conception about what the solution should look like and where we should focus our attention. Now, if you understand hermeneutic injustice in the way that I was initially articulating in the case of Fricker, what you think the key problem are certain sorts of bad attitudes, namely certain attitudes of prejudice. And what you would want to do to combat hermeneutic injustice is to focus attention on changing those kind of bad attitudes. By contrast, if you have the sort of view that I have, then you would think that your real crucial intervention point is to think about things like what are the kind of institutions in the key institutions within this epistemic system. So stuff like the structure of the media. So basically, the idea is that if you think of hermeneutic justice in this particular way, then what that does is kind of raise questions about the basic structure of our basic epistemic institutions and how to understand kind of fairness within those set of institutions. So I haven't said at all anything actually about what that kind of fairness consists in. Rather, what I'm just trying to do is kind of motivate a certain sort of normative framework for thinking through these kind of broad set of questions that we've been discussing at the conference. So thanks. Is that in the time?
Thank you very much, Alex. And next we'll hear from Peppino Ortoleva. I guess we can just leave that slide up there, or you could turn your machine off,
Sure.
Alex. It's
Maybe
up
I'll
to you.
just
Close.
I'll just close that up.
Okay, Peppino has no slides. Thank you very much, Peppino. Congratulations.
No slides, but my computer, but I'll read from it. This is one of the 2 steps back I ask you to take, no slides. The second step back is that I'm asking you to hear about some classics. That is, authors at least 50 years ago, some much more. And this, I think, is an interesting exercise, because first we'll see that this fake news being a very recent and actual problem, we'll see that many people told us important things about it many, many years ago. Classics always help. Oh, sorry. Classics always help. The second point is that my view as a historian of the present is that the present is not a point in time, but it's the point in which many different threads of different lengths in time meet. And the classics I'll talk about are like threads that take us to the different histories we can tell about fake news. So which are the classics? The first is a group of authors, actually, not a single author, but famous authors, essentially. Honoré de Balzac, who wrote what I think was the greatest novel about journalism ever written, Illusion perdue. And he also wrote a thing very much less known, which was called the Monographie de la Presse Parisienne. but also his friend Gérard de Nerval, who wrote something which may be interesting since the title. The title is A Truthful History of Fake News. Une histoire véridique du canard. All about 1843-44. And they explored the reasons why fake news were so powerful in the Parisian press of their time. The second classic is Marc Bloch, a famous historian of the Middle Ages, and he wrote in 1921 an essay called Considérations d'un historien sur les fausses nouvelles de guerre, considerations of a historian about the fake news about the war, which I think is probably the best thing that has been written about fake news up to this moment, as you'll see. And the third is an American, Richard Hofstadter, whose essay, published first time in 1963, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, teaches us a lot about conspiracy theories and conspiracy theories as a style, which is the point in Hofstadter thought. So let's start from Balzac. And this is very amusing because it has much to do with what Jim told us this morning, because Balzac says in Illusion Perdue, canard is our word for a scrap of fiction told for true, put to enliven the column of morning news when it is flat. We owe the discovery to Benjamin Franklin, the inventor of lightning rod and the Republic. These America gave to France: democracy, the lightning rod, and fake news. That's what Balzac thought. But how did Balzac and Nerval describe fake news? Canard, the history of the word is very interesting because canard was a fly sheet. Canard were distributed by newsboys, but then canard became fake news extensively, also for the fake news which were published in regular newspapers. Canard, the name canard remains in one paper, Le Canard Enchaîné, which is also famous for having destroyed the probabilities of François Fillon to become the American president, distributing not fake but real news. But that's an important point because the turning around fake, which become true, and true which become fake, was already a typical game in the French press of Balzac's time. Canard, says de Nerval, are news that are sometimes true, always overstated, often fake. And I think this is a very interesting definition, because this is what happens in many cases with what we later define fake news. But in many cases, the definition of fake news is a posteriori, when you are in the moment of reading them. Probably the definition by de Nerval is better. Often fake, always overstated. And what is very interesting in this description is that de Nerval also describes some journalists who became famous in their own time because they were famous inventors of fake news. There was a stardom of fake news. A journalist called Joseph Méry was famous because he invented the story of the sea snake in a moment particularly flat for political news, because that's the other side of it. According to Nerval, the moments for the flourishing of canard are during moments of vacations, because it is boredom that creates great oxes. And I think we always overlook the power of boredom in modern politics, which is very powerful. Or when the government wants to distract public attention from serious problems. So this is the instrumental use, which Nerval very well saw. And the final sentence of the truthful history of canard is, what is strange is that canard, those children of the coupling of paradox and fantasy, which is a very interesting definition too, always turn out to become true. Of course, always is too much, but the fact that sometimes fake news turn out to become true is something we should also consider. What is interesting in this first group of classics I was quoting is the fact that they remind us how often fake news are the fruit of the same professionals who are able to fabricate good news. Fake news often require professional competencies. We should never forget that. Many of the theories about fake news we have seen this morning and in the afternoon lay the guilt on readers, on the social networks and so on. But there is also the role of journalists in fabricating fake news. The biggest fake news ever created, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was fabricated by professional journalists, Russian professional journalists. And it was distributed by an important American daily paper called the Dearborn Independent, owned by Henry Ford. So